When I think of mothers, the descriptions that immediately come to mind are selfless, nurturing, unconditional love, and the list goes on. My instincts as a mother is to protect my child by any means. So when I hear about mothers who show complete disregard for their children, it is hard for me to comprehend. Today's story is about a truly disgusting mother who unleashed the most evil things imaginable upon a child who she was supposed to protect, nourish, and love. Hi guys, thank you for clicking on this video. If you are new to this channel, my name is Shay, and my channel focuses on truly disturbing and sometimes strange cases. Today's video is about the case of Shanda Vander Ark. If you are in the United States, you've probably heard that name before. Shanda is a lawyer who was recently found guilty of torture and unaliving of her 15-year-old son with special needs. Before I dive in, I just want to give a quick disclaimer that some of the things you'll hear in this case are truly upsetting. With that out of the way, let's jump right in. Shanda Vander Ark was born on September 15, 1979. Not much is known about Shanda, her family, or childhood. Shanda married Eric Ferguson and had 4 children with him between the years of 2000 and 2006. The names of the children in birth order were Eric, Paul, Millie, and Timothy. Not much is known about Shanda's marriage to Eric, but there were some clear signs of trouble with her parenting skills because according to court records, there was an investigation by CPS between 2009 and 2012 that resulted in a recommendation to terminate Shanda's parental rights. But rather than having the court terminate her rights, Shanda voluntarily waived her custodial rights to her children in January 2012. At the time, Shanda was residing in Oklahoma with Eric. Shanda was allowed to have supervised visitation with the children for up to 3 hours per month. After Shanda relinquished her rights to her children, it seems the children remained with Eric and Shanda eventually left Oklahoma. Shanda ultimately made her way to the Northern Shores area of Muskegon, Michigan, which is where our case today takes place. While in Michigan, Shanda married her second husband, a man named Adam Vander Ark. Shanda also had a 5th child, a boy named Gabriel, but referred to as G. However, it does not appear that Adam was G's biological father. In 2018, Shanda enrolled in Cooley Law School, where she graduated with a 3.93 GPA and second in her law school class. Shanda went on to pass the Michigan bar and worked as a judicial law clerk for a state court judge. Sometime in 2021, Shanda's ex-husband, Eric Ferguson, and Eric's wife reached out to Shanda and asked if Timothy could come live with her. According to Shanda, Eric informed her that he could no longer handle Timothy and that he needed to send him to live with Shanda. Shanda, who had not lived with Timothy since he was a little boy, remember in 2012 when Shanda lost all parental rights, Timothy would have been around 5 or 6. Nevertheless, Shanda agreed, and in May 2021, Timothy moved in with Shanda, her husband Adam, her son Paul, and her youngest son G. Timothy, who was born on August 6, 2006, was 14 years old. Timothy was on the autism spectrum. In addition to autism, Timothy was also diagnosed with ADHD, bipolar, and sensory processing disorder. He also had speech and motor impairment. He also had tubes in his ears, along with some hearing issues that made him very sensitive to certain sounds. He was on several medications when he arrived, but Shanda quickly stopped all medications because, according to her, quote unquote, they made him a zombie. Shanda never took Timothy to a doctor or consulted with any doctor before making the decision to stop all meds. Shanda claimed that she could not take Timothy to a doctor because her ex never sent his insurance cards. Shanda also never enrolled Timothy in school and claimed that because legal custody was not formally transferred to her, she could not enroll him, so she had to homeschool Timothy. In January 2012, a few months after Timothy came to live with Shanda, Adam had a stroke. After the stroke, Adam could no longer work, and this, according to Shanda, negatively affected the family financially to the point that the family was living paycheck to paycheck and could not afford any extras. Shanda could only afford basic living expenses such as rent, utilities, and food. Eventually, Adam moved out of the house and in with his own parents so they could care for him. This left only Shanda, Paul, Timothy, and G in the house. It was after Adam left the house that all hell, for lack of a better term, seemed to break loose. Shanda installed cameras throughout the house in order to keep an eye on Timothy, because according to Shanda, her ex Eric and his wife mentioned to her that he would get into everything. So Shanda proceeded to put locks on the refrigerator and pantry to keep Timothy from getting into the food. I'm sure you're probably wondering, but why the fridge and pantry? Well, according to Shanda, Timothy once ate a bag of frozen chicken nuggets, a pound of ground beef, and raw bacon. But instead of trying to figure out why perhaps he was getting into raw foods and eating, maybe he wasn't getting enough to eat. Nope, Shanda decided the better way to handle it is to lock up everything. But the reality is that when you hear the horrendous things Timothy endured, you'll probably piece together why this raw meat incident likely happened. In addition to the cameras, Shanda installed motion detectors that made a loud sound every time it detected movement. Shanda had several different forms of punishments for Timothy. One of these punishments was doing wall sits. For those that are unfamiliar with wall sits, it is typically done as a form of exercise, but it can be a form of torture. It involves sitting in a position against a wall as if seated. It can be very painful to be in this position for an extended period of time. Now, I've done these during workout routines, and sitting in this position for up to 45 seconds can be so excruciating by the end of it. And also remember those motion detector alarms that I mentioned earlier. Well, these were also placed on Timothy's body. This was done as not only a form of monitoring his movement, but also as a form of punishment. For example, one of the punishments that Timothy had to endure was standing in a corner with his hands raised above his head. If his hands dropped, the motion detectors that were attached to his body would make a loud beeping sound. Timothy, whom I mentioned had sensitive hearing, would become very distressed at the sound of this alarm. So the torture was not just meant to be physical, but it was also psychological. And if that was not inhumane enough, Paul admitted that Timothy would be forced to stand with his hands above his head from anywhere from a couple of hours to overnight. Yes, you heard that right. If you've ever held your hand over your head, you know that this is beyond painful even for just a few seconds. And in this case, this poor kid had to do this for several hours with an alarm strapped to him to monitor his hands dropping. I also want to mention that there was no indication that any of the other children, whether it was Paul or G, was subjected to any of these forms of punishments, or I should say torture. It appears that Timothy was literally the only child who received this form of punishment. Not that anybody deserves this, but I just wanted to make that clear. There were other forms of punishment that I will get into in a little bit, but I want to go back to food for a minute. According to Paul, the only meal fed to Timothy was either plain bread or bread drenched in hot sauce. Timothy would first be given the bread with hot sauce. Then once he finished this bread, he would then be entitled to plain bread 30 minutes later. Timothy also had to eat standing up by the back door of the family house. There was no explanation for why this was the case, but then again, nothing done to this poor child made any sense. If Timothy were ever to eat anything but the bread with hot sauce or plain bread, which would be given to him by Paul, he was met with Shanda's wrath. Once while watching the home camera, Shanda saw that Timothy was chewing on something, so she texted Paul to check his breath because he must have eaten something. Paul confirmed that Timothy had eaten some chips. As punishment, Timothy was made to run up and down the stairs until he was falling over with exhaustion. Sometimes Timothy would be made to stand against the wall again with his hands above his head as a form of punishment. If Shanda was out of the house while he was holding his hand up above his head, Shanda will watch him through the cameras and count how many times Timothy put his hands down. And as a form of punishment for this, she would make him run the stairs until he was again falling over with exhaustion. On another occasion, when a starving Timothy saw a half-eaten burger and took a bite out of the crust, Shanda instructed Paul to stick his hands down Timothy's throat to force him to vomit. Paul admitted that he did this on several occasions at his mother's request. Now, turning back to the various cruel and sometimes humiliating punishments that Shanda subjected Timothy to. If Timothy kept the family up at nights as punishment, he would lose the privilege of being able to sleep the next night. Sometimes Timothy would be so exhausted that he would beg to do anything, even house chores, just to be allowed to sleep. Timothy also had a timer for bathroom privileges. He was only afforded 60 seconds for pee and 2 minutes for poop. Once when Timothy had an accident in the family's garage, he was made to clean up the mess without his pants on, and then after cleaning up the mess, he had to stand against the wall with his hands up, again without his pants on. Timothy also had hot sauce poured directly into his mouth as punishment or poured on his private parts. Shanda also had Paul zip tie Timothy's hands, and after Timothy managed to remove them several times, she started to cut off the ends to keep him from removing the zip ties. And she would threaten to punish him even more if he complained that the zip ties were too tight. One of the worst forms of punishment for Timothy was being repeatedly subjected to a cold bath. This consisted of Paul filling up the bathtub with ice. Then Shanda would instruct Paul to put Timothy in the bathtub and make it even more distressing for Timothy by placing his body in odd angles so he is even more uncomfortable. Initially, Timothy had to sit in the bath for up to 30 minutes. According to Paul, the ice baths happened repeatedly for several times a day at the direction of Shanda. During these ice baths, Shanda would monitor Timothy through the video camera and instruct Paul to remain in the bathroom to ensure that Timothy did not try to get comfortable by turning on the hot water to make it warm. If Timothy tried to move around to get comfortable by either resting his head on his shoulder or on the side of the tub, Paul was instructed to put his body back in an odd angle to make sure that Timothy remained uncomfortable. At one point during this nightmarish situation, Paul became so concerned about how thin Timothy looked that he sent a picture of an emaciated Timothy to Shanda, stating his concerns. His mother's response to the photo was, "Give him some bread and peanut butter." That same day, Paul made Timothy scrambled eggs with cheese, but did not tell his mom because he knew that she would become very upset with him. Now, moving forward to the day before the tragic events of this case. It was around 2 p.m. on July 5th, 2022, when Shanda instructed Paul through the video cameras to wake Timothy up. I should mention that Timothy's sleeping space consisted of the floor of a closet in his bedroom, even though his bedroom had a bunk bed with a mattress. When Paul tried to wake Timothy up, he was unresponsive. Shanda, who was at work at the time, instructed Paul again through the cameras to put Timothy in an ice bath. Paul stated that at the time, Timothy could not walk on his own, so Paul had to drag Timothy to the ice bath. When Timothy was in the bath and remained unresponsive, Shanda instructed Paul to make him even more uncomfortable to see if that changes his responsiveness. When Timothy failed to respond, Shanda made Paul heat up a pizza roll to see if that will entice Timothy. Paul heated up the pizza roll and held it close to Timothy's nose. When Timothy finally responded, Shanda instructed Paul to pull it away from Timothy. Timothy never got to eat that pizza roll. During this same ice bath incident, Shanda also instructed Paul to pour hot sauce on Timothy's private parts, but Paul apparently refused to do this because he felt it was beyond cruel, as if everything else Timothy had gone through was not already beyond cruel. When Shanda finally returned home from work at 6 p.m., Timothy remained in that ice bath while Shanda drove Paul to work. Later, around 11:30 p.m., Shanda sent a text to Paul, and according to Paul, Timothy was still in the ice bath at that time. So it would have been now over 9 hours that Timothy had been in that ice bath. At some point during the night, Timothy was then removed from the bath and placed back in the closet. The next morning, on July 6th, Paul had to get up early to go to work. Paul went into the laundry room to get a clean pair of socks when Shanda came in to tell him that Timothy was not breathing. Paul asked Shanda if she will call 911, and Shanda responded no. Paul then went to the small closet where Timothy was forced to sleep and tried to resuscitate him. After an unsuccessful attempt, Paul and Shanda then removed Timothy from the closet. At the time, Timothy was wearing nothing but an adult diaper. Shanda instructed Paul to put his own clothes on Timothy. Paul put his jeans and also his own belt on Timothy because the pants were too big. However, instead of calling 911 again, Shanda felt it was more important to come up with a cover story. Paul was instructed to tell the police that Timothy had gone on a hunger strike, and when they woke up, they found him unresponsive in bed. So now it's been approximately 18 minutes since Shanda informed Paul that Timothy was unresponsive, and this was the time when she finally called 911. Police arrived at the house and found an extremely malnourished Timothy with obvious signs of abuse. Timothy was unfortunately declared dead at the scene. A few days later, both Shanda and Paul were arrested. Shanda was charged with murder and first-degree child abuse. Paul was charged with first-degree child abuse. The medical examiner ruled Timothy's death a homicide, listing the cause of death as a combination of multiple factors, including malnutrition and hypothermia. At the time of his death, Timothy weighed 69 pounds. Now, the average 14-year-old weighs over 100 pounds. And to further put it in perspective, my 4-year-old weighs 49 pounds. So Timothy, at 14 years old, would have been just 20 pounds heavier than my 4-year-old. At trial, Shanda did everything she could to throw Paul under the bus and refused to take any accountability for her despicable actions towards Timothy. At one point, it even came up that she had ordered leg irons for Timothy. She claimed it was Paul who ordered it because the order came from Paul's Amazon account. But in text messages to Paul, she admitted that she had bought them for Timothy. She had an excuse for everything, claimed to have PTSD, so she could not remember anything. But somehow she was able to remember that Timothy weighed at some point 104 pounds in May of 2022, and she also remembered that she put the locks on the pantry to protect Timothy because he had eaten that frozen bacon. Shanda had such a dramatic performance in court to the point where she even vomited when shown pictures of Timothy the night before he died. Yet Shanda had seen these same pictures during pre-trial proceedings but did not have the same reaction. Paul, on the other hand, was very believable. He came off as truthful and wanting to take responsibility for the awful things that happened to Timothy. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but Paul definitely appeared to have some challenges that may have made him more susceptible to Shanda's manipulation and control. I'll note that during the trial, Shanda did testify that Paul, who had come to live with her a year prior to Timothy, was also on several medications when he arrived. After the trial, Shanda was ultimately found guilty of murder and first-degree child abuse. Paul pleaded guilty to one count of child abuse. Shanda is scheduled to be sentenced on January 29, 2024. I'll be sure to update you all once that happens. So now, what is my take on Shanda and this entire case? Well, I personally think that Shanda is a psychopath who got a sick thrill out of torturing a defenseless child. While Timothy may have had some challenges due to his mental health diagnosis, that is still no excuse for the sickening and truly deranged things Shanda put him through. Shanda could have reached out to the county for services if she needed help. In fact, she worked for the county and could have asked for help at any time. She chose not to, and for me that speaks volumes and lets me know that she did not want help. Instead, she wanted to handle Timothy her way, and her way was to torture him to death. I also want to mention that there were so many more facts that I left out that show Shanda knew exactly what she was doing. For example, she went to great lengths to keep her in-laws from seeing Timothy in the condition he was in, to the point that she even tracked their cell phones to make sure that she beat them to the house anytime they came by to pick up G, and she also made sure that G would be waiting outside for them even in the middle of winter. Timothy was also never allowed outside, and if he did go out, it was only to the backyard where no neighbors could see him. And of course, he was never enrolled in school and was never taken to a doctor. Before I end these videos, I like to end with a few words about the victim, but unfortunately in this case I could not find anything about Timothy. From the little bit that came out at trial, it does appear that he had some interest in soccer and even talked about trying out for his high school team. It is just so incredibly sad that Timothy's life was tragically taken too soon by someone who was supposed to love and protect him. Home should be a safe place for children, but for Timothy, it was not. And then when you top it off with the fact that he had autism and also faced many, many challenges, and society is not always kind and patient with people with autism, it makes this story so much more heartbreaking. Timothy did not deserve anything that was done to him. He should have been provided the help he needed to deal with the myriad of mental health issues he was facing. I can't imagine at such a young age how challenging these issues must have been for him, and then on top of it to be subjected to such torture at the hands of a heartless and cold mother. As I mentioned before, Shanda could have asked for help with Timothy at any point during his stay, but she chose not to. Like most states in the U.S., Muskegon County provides autism and mental health services. If formal custody was the issue, Shanda should have sought a formal transfer, so I'm sorry, her excuses are just simply worthless. I think she was simply a sadistic person and Timothy was simply her scapegoat. She knew exactly what she was doing, and instead of getting her hands dirty, she used another son to commit her evil acts and then try to throw him under the bus. I hope she gets the harshest sentence possible, and I will be sure to provide you all an update when that happens. So let me know your thoughts on this one, guys. What do you think of Paul and him not being charged with murder? I'm conflicted. On the one hand, he is an adult and knew exactly what he was doing. But on the other hand, it is pretty obvious from watching him at trial that he likely has some developmental challenges himself. But I don't know. It's hard. So let me know what you think. Anyhow, guys, I am going to end it here. Thank you for tuning in for this case. If you appreciated this case coverage, please do hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel. Take care of yourselves, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.